Hi, and welcome to Lecture 6. In this lecture, we'll talk about different kinds of strings that Ruby supports. We'll also see many different methods that are very useful when processing the string API. And then finally, we'll talk about symbols. So Ruby has a single quote literal string, and the single quote strings in Ruby are very literal. They show almost everything as is. Double quoted strings, they have certain characters, certain special characters, like for example, \n for new line or \t for tab. And also another very interesting feature that they have is they allow string interpolation. So if you're used to, from other languages, concatenating strings with a plus, forget about it. And we'll see an example of this in a minute. But first, let's go back to the single and double quoted strings. So the single quoted string, even if it has a \n in it, it's going to just display it as is, whereas a double quoted will treat it as a new line, and that's what you see the output here. Now, here's where the string interpolation comes in. Let's say you have a method that has parameter 1 and 2 and it needs to multiply them, and it needs to return a string that says 1 multiplied by 2 equals 1 multiplied by 2. So as you could see, what's happening here is that you are embedding the values either of the actual parameters or variables, or even an expression 1 multiplied by 2, and that gets converted to a string, and you have one nice long string. And this is very useful, I think, and very expressive in that you don't have to stop and type one string, then close it and put a plus, type a value, type another string. It sort of just flows. String methods usually return a copy of a string. They don't modify the string in place unless you use the versional method that has an exclamation at the end of it. In that case, it sort of just alerts you and says, hey, are you sure you want to modify the string? And if you still do, you use that version of a method, and that will modify the string in place. And we'll see an example of that in a minute. Another way to create a string is by using the %Q, and this behaves very similar to a double quoted string, but another feature it adds is that it allows you to span multiple lines. So let's take look at some examples of using string methods. You have my name variable, which is, for example, a space and the word Tim. Now you could L-strip, which basically means left strip, and capitalize, which converts it to Tim without the space in front of it. Now, but when you look at the my name variable again, you'll see that the variable did not change. Why is that? Well, that's because all of these methods return the copy and they didn't actually modify the variable. If you would want to modify a variable, you would use the L-strip version with an exclamation, which is the destructive version, which will actually modify the variable in place. Another way to override the actual content of a variable is by using this array notation. So in this case, we're overriding the first character of my name variable over k. So now if you print out my name variable, you see that it has been changed to Kim. Here's an example of using a quote, the %Q. So it's a hot day outside, grab your umbrellas. Here we see that the string current weather also supports a method lines, which breaks the string up into multiple lines. And then you're able to use a block. Again, as we saw, blocks are very good at iterating things. And the block takes line as a parameter, and then you could substitute the strings inside, and then at the end of the day you get it's a rainy day outside, grab your umbrellas, instead of it's a hot day outside, grab your umbrellas. So a lot of really useful methods, and you can really process information that you have in very interesting ways. So strings API, if you go to this URL, ruby.doc core 2.2.2, you'll see many different methods that string has. And actually, the API that Ruby has is really nice. We have a lot of examples that you could see how things work, and it's really nice. The other kind of a string that actually catches people by surprise is this idea of a symbol. So what is a symbol? Symbol is basically a colon followed by some string. So for example, colon foo. Symbols are just a highly optimized strings. They have much less methods than strings, and they really serve a different purpose. They are constant names that you don't have to pre-declare. And if you think about it, there are two types of strings. There's a string that you want to look at the content, you want to maybe make it uppercase, lowercase, you want to extract something from the content. So that's one type. That's not what symbols are. Symbols are what's called a stands for something string type. And basically the idea here is that it's a symbol, right? It's a symbol, think of like a flag or something, right? It's just an indication that you want something to happen, but you don't really care what the exact string is and if it's uppercase, lowercase. That's not really the point of a symbol. And we'll see how they are used. The symbols are guaranteed to be unique and immutable. Now, if you want to go back and forth between a string and a symbol, you could do that as well. So for example, you're using a symbol, but maybe you decide that you really want to modify the content as a string. You could just convert the symbol, call the to_s method to convert it to a string. Now, if something is a string, you could also convert it to a symbol by saying to_sim. So a typical example of what you see in Ruby, a symbol is, it's a representation of a method name. So for example, on any object in Ruby, you could just ask, what are my methods? And it will give you all the methods that this object supports. In this case, actually, we are doing something a little more than that. We are grepping the methods for the word case. So as you could see here, the string hello has an uppercase method, a swap case, which basically makes uppercase, lowercase uppercase, and uppercase lowercase. And it's interesting that, as you would expect, there is a regular version that returns a copy of a string, and there is also the destructive version that will actually modify the string in place. So upcase, downcase, swap case as well. But the point of this slide is that this is a perfectly good application of what a symbol is. A method name is a symbol. You're not really interested in changing the method name to something else. It's just a way to capture the information. The object has a bunch of methods, and the method names are just symbols. Now, if this still doesn't sound convincing, there's definitely a gray line between symbols and strings. And a lot of times, you would expect it to be a string and it's a symbol or vice versa. And actually, it's interesting that Ruby itself, in the earlier versions of Ruby, the names of methods were not symbols, they were strings. But it really just becomes a matter of taste a lot of times. Something just makes more sense as a symbol, or some other things make more sense as strings. And sometimes, as we see by hashes, when we get to the hashes, it actually makes a lot of sense to use a symbol as opposed to using a string. In summary, strings give you the ability to use interpolation, and that's actually very cool and expressive, and it lets you finish your thought. Strings have a lot of really useful API, and you guys should really look into that. So what's next? Next, we'll talk about arrays.